Dave Mustaine's childhood wasn't just difficult. It was this revolving door of instability, poverty, deep emotional scars that really shaped his entire worldview.
Like, subscribe. Thank you.
Born September 13th, 1961 in La Mesa, California, Dave was the youngest of 4 kids in an extraordinarily dysfunctional household. His dad, John Mustaine, was an abusive alcoholic whose violent tendencies made home life completely unbearable. His mom, Emily, tried to shield the kids from the worst of it, but the marriage crumbled when Dave was just 4. The thing is, their divorce didn't bring peace. Instead, it actually introduced this whole other level of instability. And the reason for this is because John Mustaine didn't just disappear after the divorce. He was like basically a stalker. Whenever he found out where they were living, Emily would uproot the family and just move again and again, just trying to stay one step ahead of him. And the thing is, this actually had a pretty big effect on Dave because he never felt like he belonged anywhere. Trust to him was like a foreign concept. Every time he'd get to know people, get to trust people, all of a sudden Dad would come and they had to split again. Well, by the time the Mustaine settled in Costa Mesa, Dave's mom underwent a major religious transformation, becoming a Jehovah's Witness. And there were no casual faith. This was like full-on immersion. They had strict rules about avoiding anything worldly. And this meant no Christmas, no birthdays, no holidays of any kind. It's probably a really good way to save money. But in this case, for him and the family, it also meant total social isolation. Dave wasn't allowed to have any friends outside of the church, which meant all the kids he could associate with lived far away and were mostly older than him. So Dave was already a misfit in his own home, and now he was one at school as well. And at school, the alienation was public. Every morning during the Pledge of Allegiance, Dave had to stand silently while the rest of the kids put their hands on their hearts. He wasn't allowed to recite it. And of course, when they had any kind of celebrations, he wasn't able to take part in any of that either. It was like he was an outsider in his own country, and the other kids did not let him forget it. And he would recall later on that they all just wondered what the hell was wrong with him. And meanwhile, money was also a constant issue. His mom worked as a housekeeper, and they relied on state medical aid and food stamps to get by. And this came with its own set of humiliation. At school, instead of paying for lunch, he had to hand over a pink ticket government assistance. It was that branding mark of poverty, and he hated it. He wore all secondhand clothes, most of them either a bit short or a bit small. Kids noticed, and even within his own family, Dave felt like an afterthought.
I grew up like that, getting secondhand clothes. And, you go to school and your pants are like this short, and that's like when you're standing up straight, that's not cool at all.
He was one of those latchkey kids, coming home to an empty house every day, letting himself in with a key that was around his neck. But he did have one real escape, and that was music. And his first exposure to rock wasn't a grand epiphany. It was actually a local band. This group called the Syndicate, and they were practicing in a garage. The drummer for the band was snapping at the band, going, "Somebody's out of tune." Dave thought the guy sounded like a dick, but it actually planted a seed. Soon after, he saw a guitar player ripping through Rush songs at a party, and something clicked. It was at that very moment he knew what he wanted to do. Dave Mustaine's first guitar wasn't bought, it was actually stolen. He was still a teen, living in that cycle of instability, broke, angry, desperate for something to latch onto. Music was gnawing at his brain, but guitars were not cheap, and he didn't have a way to get one. So he did what was basically the only option. He just took one. Later on, he would actually make amends for it, tracking down the guy and giving him a much more valuable guitar in return. But it didn't take Dave long to start figuring things out. Lessons were not an option. No money, no connections. So he taught himself, playing by ear, basically trying to decode these sounds himself. He was really into British metal. Judas Priest, Iron Maiden, Motorhead. Their music wasn't polished or pretty, and it hit just right for exactly what he needed. Dave started selling pot in order to support his growing obsession with music. At first, it was just about making money to buy more records, but it didn't take long and it ended up turning into a full-blown operation. He had a system. He'd sell dime bags and then take the money straight to a record store where an employee would trade him, import albums under the table. And that's exactly how he got his hands on records that the other kids weren't even aware of yet. The guitar, the music, it was all building towards something. And that something became Panic, his first real band. The lineup was loose, a bunch of young, reckless guys just trying to figure stuff out. They played gigs, and for a while it felt like something was actually happening. But then just like that, it was over. Mike Leftwich Panic's drummer, died in a car accident after a gig. Mustaine was not in the car that night, but it really hit him hard. He wasn't just losing a bandmate, he was losing the entire foundation of what Panic had been. It was a tragic event, and it was a dead end. But the music didn't stop. It was just that everything was spiraling out of control. And by this point in Dave's life, drinking wasn't just an occasional thing, it was a ritual. And he wasn't alone in that either. The guys around him were just as deep into it. Getting wasted became part of the routine. And there were drugs too. Weed, coke, speed, whatever the hell was around. Heroin hadn't entered the picture yet, but the road was already paved. And then came the infamous recycler ad. A new band was looking for a guitar player. Some Danish guy named Lars Ulrich picked up the phone when Mustaine called. And they talked music. All the new wave of British metal bands. The good stuff. And Lars liked what he heard. He told Mustaine to come meet the rest of the group, and the guys didn't even audition him. He plugged in, started warming up, and before he even asked if he was going to get the part, they told him he got the job already. Just like that, Dave Mustaine was in Metallica. Now, Mustaine's entrance into Metallica wasn't just a new gig, it was actually this whole new collision course. The band was still in its infancy, but their energy was already there. James Hetfield was handling vocals and rhythm guitar, Lars on drums, and Ron McGovney, Hetfield's old friend, was on bass. They were loud, messy, rough around the edges, but there was definitely something there. Still, before Mustaine showed up, they lacked a real lead guitar player who would give them that firepower that they needed. And that's why Lars had been so quick to hand him the job before he even officially tried out. But it didn't take long for the band dynamic to start shifting around him. James was still growing into his role as a front man, still finding his voice, not just as a singer, but really as a presence. And Lars, though ambitious, was not an exceptional drummer by any stretch. Mustaine, on the other hand, had that swagger from day one. His playing was aggressive, technical, frenetic, and he had this real natural confidence about him that made him stand out. And immediately he started taking the lead in a lot of ways, talking to promoters, handling money after gigs, even stepping in as the mouthpiece for the band between songs when James wasn't feeling comfortable doing it. And in Dave's mind, he wasn't just the guitar player, he was the leader of the group. But there was one single problem: alcohol. They were all drinking, constantly. It wasn't just a way to cut loose. It was part of the culture that they were building. They were young, broke, living in absolute squalor. They spent their time at Ron McGovney's house in Norwalk, California, where Metallica had set up in his garage. But things were deteriorating fast. Mustaine was the heaviest drinker, and when he drank, he wasn't just a loudmouth, he was completely volatile. He'd get aggressive, pick fights, lash out, and it didn't take much to set him off. The tension boiled over one day when James kicked Dave Mustaine's dog. The dog, the small but tough pit bull, had hopped onto Ron McGovney's car, and so James booted the dog off of it. And that was it. Mustaine snapped and punched James squarely in the face. And that kind of thing didn't just blow over. James wasn't a softie, but he wasn't the type to fight back directly either. Lars, James, and Ron started pulling away from Mustaine, and the resentment was growing on both sides. But despite all of this, the band was actually getting sharper. The gritty vibes and the reckless speed that they were playing at was something different than what was happening in metal at the time. The songs were taking shape, and Mustaine was writing a lot of the riffs that would later become the backbone of Kill 'Em All. But he had no idea that Metallica was already moving toward a future that did not include him. The cracks in the foundation of Metallica were widening, and Mustaine did not see it coming. He knew there was a tension. He could feel it. But in his mind, he was Metallica's lead guitar player, one of the driving forces behind the sound that they were creating. He didn't think for a second that the band was looking for a way to replace him. And by late 1982, Metallica was ready to take things to the next level. They had the No Life to Leather demo, and it was getting passed around in the underground tape trading circles, generating a whole hell of a lot of buzz. Mustaine's fingerprints were all over it. His riffs were the backbone of Mechanics, which Metallica would later rework into the Four Horsemen. Jump in the Fire, Phantom Lord, Metal Militia. But even as the band was gaining this momentum, his relationship with the others was still deteriorating really fast. The drinking was constant, and it came with the fights. And Mustaine's unpredictability was really starting to become apparent. Ron McGovney, who had always been the odd man out in Metallica, was really the first casualty of the band's internal strife. He had started as a placeholder bass player, never really fitting in with the rest of them. He wasn't a bad player, but he wasn't on their level creatively. He was also the only member of the group that actually had something to lose. His parents had money, and it was his house that they were wrecking with every rehearsal and party. When Mustaine drunkenly poured beer all over his bass pickups, frying his gear, it was the final straw. McGovney said, "Fuck this, I'm out." However, that opened the door for Cliff Burton. Now, Cliff was a completely different animal. A serious musician who knew his theory, had a distinctive style, and wasn't just some fill-in bass player. But Cliff's arrival changed the internal dynamics of the group. He and James bonded immediately, and Lars, who already looked up to Cliff, was more than happy to bring him in as a stabilizing force. But the divide between Mustaine and the band was just continuing to deepen. The breaking point came on April 11, 1983. Metallica had already decided that Mustaine was out. He just did not know it yet. At around 9 a.m., Hetfield, Ulrich, and Burton shook him awake. Dave's head was pounding from the previous night's drinking, his mouth dry, body aching. Basically just another brutal hangover and a long line of them. But this time, something was different. James looked serious. Lars wasn't running his mouth like he usually did. And then came those words, "You're out of the band." No warning, no conversation, just a decision that had already been made. Dave Mustaine was completely blindsided. He had been reckless, sure. Violent, absolutely. But this? Metallica was a band that called itself Alcoholica. A band where getting wasted was a nightly ritual anyway. And somehow, he was the problem? The difference was, when Lars and James got drunk, they were loud, annoying, maybe destructive. But Mustaine, he was considered to be more on the dangerous side. He'd take things too far. And when somebody crossed him, he didn't just shrug it off, he made it war. And now war has been made on him. Still groggy, he asked when his flight back to California was. And that's when they dropped the real insult. There was no flight, just a bus ticket. A 4-day trip back home. To make things worse, the bus was scheduled to leave in an hour, but he barely had time to process what was happening, let alone pack. And Metallica had planned this down to the last minute. His replacement, Kirk Hammett, was already lined up. Dave's fate was sealed, and he never even saw it coming. Scrambling to throw his things together, he was driven to the Port Authority bus terminal by James and dumped onto the curb, still half out of it, trying to make sense of everything that had just unraveled. In his mind, he had built this band. He had written some of their best material, and now he was just being cast out like he was disposable. And the ride home was hell. 4 days of sitting in his own fury. No real food, nowhere to go, just endless miles of nothing but his thoughts. The first stretch of that ride, he was just stewing in rage. By the second day, the anger was morphing into something else, which was actually determination. He wasn't just going to move on, he was actually going to get even. And at some point, he reached into his pocket, pulled out this handbill he had grabbed at some point, something from Senator Alan Cranston talking about nuclear stockpiling. And the phrase on the front of it had caught his eye. The arsenal of Megadeth can't be rid. Dave Mustaine didn't waste any time. The moment he stepped off that bus, he had a mission. Put together a band that would obliterate Metallica. Outplay them, outspeed them, out-thrash them in every single way. But first he had to survive. Still broke, without a permanent place to stay, he just bounced around, crashing where he could. For a while he lived with a friend, Carrie, and her mother in Huntington Beach. It wasn't much, but it kept him off the streets. His days were spent in a haze of booze, bitterness, and new ideas. He was already working on songs. Chosen Ones, Skull Beneath the Skin, Looking Down the Cross. And these ideas were much more dark, fast, and vicious. He knew what he wanted this band to be, even if he didn't have the right people yet. And at first, he hadn't even settled on a name. Falling Angels would have been the working title, for a brief moment. It seemed like it could stick, but something about it just wasn't quite right. Sounded like every other metal band trying to be ominous. But then there was Megadeth, the word that had burned itself into his brain on that hellish bus ride back from New York. He had already written a song called Megadeth, and kept coming back to it. Then one night, while driving around with a short-lived first vocalist, Lawrence Kane, made a simple but game-changing suggestion. Why not just call the band Megadeth? That was it. That was the name. But Mustaine still wasn't convinced that he should be the front man. His voice had the right vibe and attitude, but he wasn't sure if it was enough. And that's why Lawrence Kane had been in the picture at all, is because he was supposed to be the singer. But it didn't last long. Kane was out pretty much as fast as he was in. And Mustaine knew that he was going to have to take the mic himself. If he was going to lead this band, It had to be all him. His riffs, his words, hell, his rage. The only problem, he still did not have a lineup. That changed when he met David Ellefson. Ellefson, who just landed in LA fresh out of Minnesota. Kid with big dreams and making it big in metal. He and his friends were living in the same apartment complex as Mustaine, completely unaware of who he was. One day, needing booze and cigarettes, but still underage, they figured the long-haired guy upstairs might be able to help. They knocked on his door and got a response they weren't expecting. The door slammed in their faces. Confused, they knocked again. This time, Dave Mustaine let them in. It was about 6 weeks after his Metallica firing, and he was already writing songs for whatever came next. Didn't have a band, but still looking. Ellefson and his friend Greg Handevitt, both dressed in stretch jeans, leather jackets, and bullet belts, looked the part, and more importantly, they were hungry to play. So Mustaine played them some of the new material that he was working on, and Dave was blown away. The riffs were next level, and he knew right away that he had to be a part of this. Handevitt made the first move, jamming with Dave Mustaine. Ellefson followed shortly after. He still had to prove himself, though. Mustaine was not going to let just anybody in, and he tested Ellefson constantly, seeing if he had the chops and the right attitude. And then came the moment that sealed the deal. One night, Ellefson knocked on Mustaine's door asking to borrow cigarettes, and again Ellefson was met with a door slamming back into his face. But a few minutes later there was another knock. Ellefson was back, and this time with his own pack. Mustaine grinned, and that was the answer he was looking for. Megadeth had its first permanent member. So at this point, Mustaine had a name, a bass player, definitely a vision, but what he didn't have was stability. The first few months of Megadeth were chaos, constant lineup changes, struggles, tension, but Ellefson was locked in. But their first guitar player, Greg Handevitt, didn't last long. Greg was one of Ellefson's old friends from Minnesota, but he really wasn't cut out to do that kind of stuff in the band. So he left early, though he later claimed that he was the one who convinced Mustaine to actually keep Dave Ellefson. Either way, Megadeth was already shedding members before they even got started. And then came the drummer problem. They needed somebody fast and technical, able to keep up with that kind of music that Dave Mustaine was writing. Basically thrash metal at warp speed. And their first real attempt was Lee Rausch, who had played on their first official demo, Last Rites. And for a moment, it looked like things were actually solidifying. But Megadeth were already developing this reputation. It wasn't a band where you could just sit back and play drums. Mustaine's expectations were brutal, and if you couldn't hack it, you were gone. So Lee did not last. They also briefly picked up Slayer's Kerry King to play guitar, trying to round out their sound with another high-caliber player. But King was never going to stick around. He had his own group, his own ambitions. He played a handful of shows with Megadeth, got a feel for Mustaine's intensity, and decided he was better off focusing on Slayer. That left them scrambling once again. And then they found Gar Samuelson. Now, Gar wasn't your typical thrash drummer. He actually came from a jazz fusion background, playing with a whole hell of a lot of technicality that really set him apart from just the pure speed-focused metal drummers of the time. But it turned out to be the perfect combination for Dave Mustaine. He could do things that other drummers could not. And Gar also had this level of finesse and groove and the ability to push the songs to these new, unpredictable places. And not long after, Chris Poland joined on the lead guitar. And like Gar, Chris wasn't just another metal shredder. He had some serious jazz chops, and his playing really was on another level. He could do blistering speed that Mustaine wanted, but he could also weave in these complex, fluid lines that gave Megadeth something really unique. If Metallica were brute force, Megadeth was full-on precision. And so now with Mustaine, Ellefson, Samuelson, and Poland, the classic lineup of early Megadeth was completely locked in. But that did not mean the struggles were over. For one thing, the band were dead broke. Combat Records had handed Megadeth $8,000 to make their debut, and within weeks, it was almost entirely gone. Not spent on studio time. Not spent on better equipment. They blew it on booze, drugs, food, and basic survival. Now at this time, Chris Poland and Gar Samuelson were really deep into heroin. Mustaine was still drinking himself to oblivion. And while Ellefson was more level-headed, he wasn't exactly in a position to stop the downward spiral. Before they even booked all their studio time, the money was already running dry. And then reality set in. They needed more. With almost nothing left and an album still unfinished, they went back to Combat Records begging for more money. And the label was not exactly rich themselves, but they reluctantly handed over another $4,000, bringing their total budget to $12,000. Still a lot less than Metallica's $15,000 for Kill 'Em All. but somehow they ended up blowing through that as well. And it was a constant cycle of chaos during that point. Chris Poland and Gar Samuelson were selling their gear for drug money, forcing Mustaine and Ellefson to track it down and buy it back so they could at least get this damn album finished. And every dollar that came in barely made it into the studio. And at one point, they actually had a legitimate producer, but that did not last long. Once again, the money ran out, and they had to can him. And that left them with Carrot Fay, the engineer from the Last Rites demo, who stepped in for $50 a day to produce this new album. And the process of recording this album itself was miserable. The band slept in the studio, which really wasn't a studio at all. Indigo Ranch was actually a converted sauna with no plumbing, no bathroom, barely any heating or cooling. The group were essentially homeless, crashing in their cars, barely scraping together meals. Yet somehow, despite all the madness, they got the album done. And Mustaine had actually carried out what he planned on doing, which was to have this group that was faster, angrier, more technically intense than Metallica. And Mustaine made sure that Mechanic was on that album, performed twice as fast as Metallica's reworked Four Horsemen, just to prove a point. But there was more disaster waiting for them. Combat lost the original cover art. The vision had been Vic Rattlehead, their skeletal mascot, wrapped in metal bindings, a symbol of censorship and control. Instead, Combat replaced it with a plastic skull covered in what looked like tin foil and ketchup. To the band, it looked cheap, awful, totally embarrassing. They hated it, but there was nothing they could do. But on June 12th, 1985, Killing Is My Business and Business Is Good was released. And it wasn't an instant hit, no real marketing push, no radio play or major backing, but still word spread fast. The underground metal scene had certainly taken notice. Megadeth had officially arrived, and Metallica was not the only game in town anymore. So I've done some deep dives on Megadeth albums, including this one. I left the links below. So far I've covered Killing Is My Business and Business Is Good, Peace Sells But Who's Buying, and Rust in Peace, doing deep dives on each. I want to thank my subscribers. You all are truly a source of inspiration, and I appreciate you giving me a nice kick in the ass every single day. And to those of you who are new, come and join the family. Smack that subscribe button extraordinarily hard, and while you're at it, give that like button an absolute huge freaking kick as well. Just don't send your monitor flying too hard. I want to thank you so much for watching.